This business meeting will come to order pursuant to the notice issued on September 29, 2021. Chairman Peters asked me to get us started today, and he will be joining us shortly. The committee is meeting to consider two critical pieces of cybersecurity legislation and the following nominations to the Merit Systems Protection Board and the District of Columbia Courts. Ms. Kathy Harris to be a member and chair of the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB. Mr. Tristan Levitt and Mr. Raymond Limon to be MSPB members. Ms. Tova Calderon to be an associate judge on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. And Ms. Ruta Gunta, Ms. Kenya Sion Lopez, and Mr. Sean Staples to be Associated Justices on the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. The Merit Systems Protection Board is an independent agency that is critical to ensuring an effective and accountable federal government. The bipartisan three-member board adjudicates cases involving whistleblower retaliation and violations of civil service laws. Unfortunately, the MSPB has been completely vacant for over 2 years and without a quorum for nearly 5 years, leading to an unprecedented backlog of over 3,400 cases waiting for action. Federal employees, like the 12,000 who live in Nevada, may have had cases pending before the board for years, even whistleblowers fired in apparent retaliation for speaking up but unable to get relief from the MSPB. All three MSPB nominees before us today are well qualified and bring significant experience with federal employee and whistleblower matters. They're ready to work together to tackle the challenge before MSPB head-on, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting these nominations today. The 4 D.C. judicial nominees are also well qualified to serve on the local District of Columbia courts. Both the Superior Court and the District of Columbia Court of Appeals are struggling with heavy caseloads and several vacancies. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting each of these nominations. We also have cybersecurity legislation. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act is bipartisan legislation from Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman, requiring critical infrastructure owners and operators to report substantial cyber incidents to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act, which I am proud to support, will provide federal agencies with much-needed data that will enhance the government's ability to understand and combat cyber attacks in real time. It will counter and prosecute criminal cyber actors and decrease the chances of a massive cyber attack that disrupt the lives and livelihoods of Americans. This bill will also greatly help Nevadans who, according to the FBI, lost over $44 million to cyber criminals in 2020. Ransomware attacks are also becoming an increasingly significant problem, including an attack earlier this summer on a Nevada hospital system that reportedly exposed the private data of 1.3 million people. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act will also require most entities, except small businesses and individuals, to report if they made a ransom payment. This will give the federal government a better understanding of the threat of ransomware attacks, which will enable certain agencies to provide assistance and support ransomware attack victims, as well as discourage ransom payments, minimize harms, punish adversaries, and deter future attacks. We will also be considering bipartisan legislation to update the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or Fisma. This requires federal agencies and contractors to report when they are hit by cyber attacks. The reforms to Fisma will ensure the federal government takes a risk-based approach to mitigate cybersecurity threats to our federal networks. The bill will help bolster CISA's lead role in supporting agency information security programs, ensuring that CISA is the central point for reporting and helping to remediate incidents and breaches on federal networks or on any information systems that manage or store federal data. Fisma 2021 makes long overdue improvements to the responsibilities and authorities of all federal agencies while ensuring that CISA has the visibility, the resources, and the capabilities to support greater information sharing, security protections, and response activities that will boost agency cybersecurity postures and promote a more cohesive federal cybersecurity environment. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act and the reform to Fisma will greatly improve the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure and federal networks. With that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Portman. Senator Portman, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate everyone coming together this morning. We've got a lot on our plate. We have two important cybersecurity bills we're going to consider. In recent years, these hostile cyber adversaries, both foreign and domestic, have executed some of the most damaging hacks, cyber attacks in our nation's history. Both the federal government and the private sector companies have been targeted and are increasingly being targeted. We held hearings on several of these incidents. As the members know, we held hearings on some of the well-known ones like SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline attacks. Both of these incidents are stark reminders of the wide-ranging and real-world impacts of sophisticated cyber attacks. It affects our constituents directly. We need greater transparency into the frequency and effect of these attacks. That was one of the, I think, consensuses we reached in talking to those who were attacked and talking to some of the federal agencies involved in this. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act will require critical infrastructure to report to CISA. That's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We've tried to put CISA at the center of this. One of my concerns has been the lack of accountability because there's so many federal entities involved. But we've got to be sure that CISA is getting these reports. There's also a provision here that says that they are required to report within 72 hours when a breach occurs. We went back and forth on this and ended up with this 3-day limit, which you think is the right balance to ensure that CISA continues to be a collaborative entity working with these businesses and giving businesses time to make these reports in an appropriate way. There's also a notice of ransomware payments within 24 hours. This information will give CISA and its federal law enforcement partners greater insights into cyber attacks on critical infrastructure to better combat this threat. We also know that federal agencies have failed to make meaningful progress in implementation of their own strong cybersecurity practices as required by the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, Fisma. 2 months ago in August, Chairman Peters and I released a report detailing the significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities of 8 different key federal agencies: Homeland Security, State, Transportation, HUD, HHS, Ag, and Education and Social Security. This report followed a 2019 report I issued with Senator Carper when I was chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, evaluating these same 8 agencies. In this year's report, only one of those agencies had an effective cybersecurity program, DHS. Every other agency featured in the report failed to meet the basic standards. We also found the average grade across all government agencies was a C-. The report identifies several common agency vulnerabilities, including the failure to adequately protect personally identifiable information, maintain an accurate and up-to-date list of the agency's IT assets, install security patches in a timely fashion, and retire vulnerable legacy technology that's no longer secure. Securing fragmented federal networks against increasingly sophisticated attacks is critical, and yet it's not being done. In the 7 years since FISMA was updated in 2014, federal agencies still have the same vulnerabilities year after year, putting America's data at risk. Today, we plan to take steps to remedy these systematic failures through the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2021. It incorporates recommendations from these bipartisan reports we talked about. It also makes clear that CISA will play a leading role in helping secure federal networks by ensuring that federal agencies and federal contractors provide notice to CISA when they do suffer a cyber attack. Agencies will also have to provide notification to victims whose personal identifying information was compromised within 45 days. And also, we are updating the required notifications to Congress. In particular, this committee will get reports when an agency fails to do its job and when it suffers a major cyber incident. And finally, while we plan to consider a bill today regarding inspectors general, I very much appreciate Senator Peters agreeing to my request to hold that bill over to the next business meeting so we have a chance to more fully vet it. Senators Johnson and Scott also sent a letter to that regard. I appreciate that letter. I just think this is such an important issue and typically has been very bipartisan. And we need to show the IGs that we do have bipartisan support, that we have their back. And so my hope is that we'll be able to have further discussions about the IG legislation and be able to mark that up in the future. We're also considering 3 nominees for the D.C. Superior Court and 1 for the D.C. Court of Appeals today, as well as these 3 nominees that were talked about for the Merit Systems Protection Board. I want to speak briefly about the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB. Many of us on this committee know the MSPB has been without a quorum since January of 2017. I think that's a problem. So we want to get these people in place. The current backlog of cases is over 3,400. Addressing the backlog is something that ought to be done. While we are voting on 3 nominees to MSPB today, I have strong concerns about one, Ms. Harris, who is nominated to be the chair of the board. I expressed those concerns during the hearing and my conversations with her. Members of this MSPB have to be steadfast in their impartiality. I will read you what it says on their website about what MSPB's primary statutory function is. It's to protect federal merit systems against partisan, political, and other prohibited practices. We've got to treat each federal employee that comes before the MSPB the same. And through her very partisan statements, Ms. Harris has generated doubt as to whether she can meet that standard. So I will not be able to support her nomination today. I do look forward to supporting both Raymond Limon and Tristan Levitt, who have both demonstrated a commitment to protect the federal merit systems. We also have 4 judicial nominees today. I plan to support the nominations of Ms. Putaguta, Ms. Lopez, and Mr. Staples to be associate judges for the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. I will not, however, be supporting Ms. Calderon's nomination to the D.C. Court of Appeals. I have concerns about her judicial philosophy, again, as we expressed in the hearing. The D.C. court system has an important role to play in addressing the district's most pressing issues, including the recent increase in violent crime, and I hope that each of our Superior Court nominees are prepared to take on this important role. With that, thank you, Chairman Peters. I look forward to a robust discussion today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman, and thank you, Senator Rosen, for opening up this markup and sharing. We will now proceed to vote, starting with nominations. I know everyone's on a tight schedule, and I've asked that any additional members who want to speak to do so after we vote on these. I understand members have asked for roll calls for the nomination of Kathy Harris and Tova Calderon. We'll proceed to consider these 2 nominees first. I note the presence of quorum. First, we are considering 2 separate nominations. Kathy Harris has been nominated to serve as a member of the Merit Systems Protection Board and as the chairperson of the MSPB. We will have a roll call vote, but I ask unanimous consent that we consider both of the nominations en bloc. Without objection. Hearing no objection, the question is on the favorably reporting these nominations. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Carper. Aye. Senator Hassan. Aye. Senator Sinema. Aye. Senator Rosen. Aye. Senator Padilla. Aye. Senator Ossoff. Aye. Senator Portman.
No.
Senator Johnson.
No.
Senator Paul.
Senator Paul is no by proxy.
Senator Langford. No. Senator Romney. No. Senator Scott. No. Senator Hawley. No. Senator Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote of those present, the yeas are 7, the nays are 6. On the vote by proxy, and for the record only, the yeas are 0, the nays are 1. On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 6, and the motion to report the nominee is agreed to.
I have to say. The nominee is favorably reported. We now proceed to the consideration of Tova Calderon to be the associate judge on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. The question is on whether to favorably report Ms. Calderon's nomination. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Carper. No. Senator Hassan. Aye. Senator Sinema. No. Senator Rosen. Aye. Senator Padilla. Aye. Senator Ossoff. Aye. Senator Portman.
No.
Senator Johnson.
No.
Senator Paul.
No by proxy.
Senator Langford. No. Senator Romney. No. Senator Scott. No. Senator Hawley. No. Senator Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote of those present, the yeas are 7, the nays are 6. On the vote by proxy, and for the record only, the yeas are 0, the nays are 1. On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 6, and the motion to report the nominee is agreed to.
The nomination is favorably reported to the Senate. There's no further debate. I ask unanimous consent that we consider reporting the following nominations en bloc. Tristan Levitt and Raymond Limon to be members of the Merit Systems Protection Board, and Rupa Puttagunta and Kenya Sidone Lopez and Sean Staples to be the Associate Judges on the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. Hearing no objection, the question is on favorably reporting these 5 nominees to the floor. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The majority.
By proxy, Senator Paul is a no.
So the majority, President, have affirmed yes. Paul will be recorded as a no.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hawley.
I'd like to be recorded as a no for Lopez and Puttagunta, please.
You will be recorded as such.
Thank you.
Senator Scott.
I'd like to be recorded as a no for Limon, Lopez, Puttagunta, and Staples.
You will be recorded as such. Hearing no further comments, we will now proceed to the consideration of S-2875, the Cyber Incident Reporting Act of 2021. I ask unanimous consent that the committee consider the Peters-Portman substitute amendment to S-2875 as the underlying bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Scott.
Sure. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for bringing attention to this important issue. I support the intent of this bill, but I do believe that another onerous government mandate on our small businesses is not the answer. I think there's an opportunity for CISA and DHS to educate the public on what to look for when it comes to ransom payments and cyber attacks. My experience is if you give people good information, they'll truly make good decisions and make the right choice, which I think is a good idea for DHS and CISA to launch a public education campaign to educate our small businesses on cyber attacks and encourage voluntary reporting. I agree that critical infrastructure entities should report ransom payments, and that's why I offered an amendment to modify this bill to focus specifically on our critical infrastructure. But with small businesses already struggling to bounce back after the pandemic, and inflation hurting them as well, this mandate will just make it harder for mom and pops to simply run their businesses. Under my amendment, reporting of ransomware payments would be mandatory only for critical infrastructure entities and state and local governments. CISA would retain the ability to request voluntary reporting of ransom payments from everyone else. Without this critical change to the text, CISA could subpoena even small businesses for failing to report a ransom payment within 24 hours. Further, they could even be referred to the Department of Justice for something as simple as reporting, in CISA's opinion, in an incomplete manner to a subpoena, and they could even be barred from contracting with the federal government. Local grocery stores, car dealerships, hardware stores, hotels in my state will all be unknowingly affected by this government mandates. And for that reason, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. We should be doing, I think we all agree we ought to be doing everything we can to get this economy going again. I now request a roll call vote on Scott 1.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Portman.
Chairman, Senator Scott's amendment would limit the reporting of ransomware payments, just to make that clear. This is about ransomware, not about the broader bill. I understand where he's coming from, and I plan to support the amendment.
Any other comments, Senator?
Mr. Chairman, I also want to support Senator Scott's amendment. Again, critical infrastructure, those businesses are already highly regulated, and they are critical by nature. Small businesses are not. There is such a proliferation of these ransomware that there's no limit even in terms of the size of the ransom here. So you're putting a burden on businesses. They could be held accountable in some way, shape, or form. We really don't know. If they're suffering a cyber attack and a ransom attack, they're just trying to keep their business operating. They won't even know that they're supposed to be reporting to some government authority, one that they've never even heard of. So I've heard that apparently business supports this provision. If that's actually true, it's just an example of regulatory Stockholm syndrome, where there's something much worse on the horizon. They're agreeing to this just to give themselves some measure of relief. So it'd be very, very unwise to force small businesses, non-critical infrastructure businesses, to be reporting these ransom attacks. They are rampant through our economy. In terms of government having access to what's happening here, there's so many of them. They can take a look at this on a case-by-case basis. You're just simply not. Government wouldn't be able to handle all this information anyway. So it's an onerous requirement that's completely unnecessary, and I completely support Senator Scott's amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Romney.
Just ask a question with regards to this amendment from Senator Scott, and that is, does this applies then under your amendment? It eliminates the requirement for reporting unless it's critical infrastructure. Does that also say if a business of, let's say, 5,000 employees, it also doesn't report? Is that right? So no businesses report. I do think that I intend to support this amendment, but I do think that there's a need for communication by businesses, that particularly if there's huge ransomware payments being made, to know that so that our FBI can follow up and find out who's doing this. And if we don't report, if that's not reported, because I'm thinking of all the businesses. I don't know any of the businesses that I've invested in were critical infrastructure, and yet if they were all getting attacked, I think we'd want to know that if cars are being stolen, for instance, in a neighborhood, you'd want people to report their car was stolen so that the police could identify this is an area of concern. If businesses are not reporting these ransomware attacks, or similarly, if they're not reporting attacks where people's personal information is stolen, people's credit card information, addresses, and so forth, I think that is a very unfortunate absence of information that would be helpful for our law enforcement community and for other businesses to know that other businesses are being attacked. If 5 hotel companies are being attacked, I presume the 6th would like to know that. I'll support the amendment, but I wish we could go back and revisit the reporting, because 50 employees is a big restaurant, all right, and having a restaurant have to report strikes me as being excessive. But 500 employees, 1,000 employees, 5,000 employees, at some point you really do want people reporting, and particularly if information is stolen, private information is stolen, if technology is stolen, or if there's ransomware. So I just feel like we're in kind of a strange position here, and I guess I certainly see I don't want to have little businesses have to get overwhelmed with a reporting requirement. At the same time, I'd like law enforcement to know what's going on so we have some shot of stopping the bad stuff that is going on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, before I recognize Senator Scott, I appreciate those comments, Senator Romney, and that's really the what's behind this bill, is that we need to know what's happening out there so that law enforcement can act appropriately. We've had several hearings on this issue before this committee. We heard very clear testimony from the FBI, from the Director of CISA, Secretary of Homeland Security, and others, that having incident reporting is essential for us to get our arms around what is a significant problem. That's not just hitting big businesses, it's hitting small businesses, and quite frankly, when it hits a small business, it's absolutely catastrophic to those small businesses. And it's, in fact, there are studies that show small businesses, nearly or more than a majority, will be out of business within 12 to 18 months after being hit with ransomware. This is an existential threat, and small businesses are saying, why isn't someone stepping up and helping us fight against these bad guys who are sophisticated and are attacking us? And they will always go after the path of least resistance, or folks who are not fully, do not have the resources to fully protect themselves. And that's why this legislation is supported by the business community. Other businesses want to know what other businesses are being hit so that they can prepare their own systems so that they're not hit. In terms of the number, that is something that we are going to negotiate. I think Senator Langford is going to be talking about that later. We have a number of 50 now, but that's certainly not carved in stone. I think that's the kind of conversation that we want to have in this markup as to what is an appropriate amount. But I think it's also important to, as we're thinking about that level, as to the bad guys are going for the path of least resistance, they will go to wherever they think the federal government's not going to be involved in helping and trying to prevent them from being engaged, that could also create a zone of opportunity for the bad actors to seek out those businesses in particular. So it's a balancing act. I don't want to be burdensome on small businesses. 50 may be too small. I'm certainly very open to that. That was the initial conversation, that could be too small. But to your point, certainly 500 I think is very big. And as they go to pay ransomware, they're going to be going to third-party vendors as well who are engaged in this kind of activity. They'll know about CISA. They'll know about reporting activities. They're going to have all the information that they need. But we've heard loud and clear from both law enforcement folks that they need this information, and from other businesses that said, help get your arms around this so we can prepare accordingly. And that's why I'll be voting no on this amendment. Senator Scott.
So first off, businesses can already report if they want to. And so, but I think we ought to rely on, let businesses make a choice on their own. It's their business. It's not the government's business. They should make this choice on their own. And we shouldn't have some burdensome regulation and then have a federal agency that can refer you to Department of Justice and to deal with all of that. And on top of that, be kicked out of government contracting. I just think, I don't know why we want a business that got hurt. Now we want to hurt them twice, possibly.
Thank you, Member Portman.
Yeah, I think, Senator Romney, you make some good points, and our hearings were about this issue, and yet the hearings really focused on critical infrastructure. And I view this as the first step. You know, there were concerns expressed by Senator Scott about the burdens. We think this is the right balance, certainly as it relates to critical infrastructure. As I said earlier, we had discussions about the time frame, we've had discussions about the penalty, we've had discussions now about the size of the business, but the goal, as I understood it, for our group on a bipartisan basis was to really focus in on the critical ones. So that's a starting point. But I don't disagree with you that this information is valuable, not just for law enforcement purposes or the government, but for the other businesses to know what's going on and to be prepared to defend themselves. And you know, we've got plenty of issues in the federal government as well, as we talked about. And so that information can be helpful there as well. But I think this is the first step, and that's why I intend to support Senator Scott's amendment.
Senator Langford.
Senator Peters, thank you. Thanks for holding this conversation. I do think we need to have a protracted conversation on this. We've had some good dialogues before about this issue, but not about this text and trying to be able to work through it. There have been a lot of questions flying around about how we're going to actually resolve this. The more I dig in this over the last 48 hours of knowing that this was coming and this is the text and this is where we are and trying to combine this, the more questions that I have. Going back to Senator Scott's statement before, if a car dealer has 10 cars that are stolen, there is no requirement currently that they report that to the FBI. Now, they'd probably be smart to do that to local law enforcement, but there is no requirement to do that. We are creating a new requirement for businesses that if they have this type of theft, even if it's a low dollar amount, a $500 amount, whatever it may be, that they just pay and get rid of, that they have to be able to report it. And not only that they have to be able to report it, but 24 hours after the report is made is this requirement that they've got to make sure that this is in. So there's a whole series of issues that are here that I have questions on this. Not only that we are creating this new mandate for this, and it may go down to a hotel or a restaurant or a car dealer or a landscaping company to be able to deal with this type of new burden for them that they have no idea who CISA is. And now they're suddenly figuring out they're violating federal law when they paid a ransomware of $500 for their landscaping company that they thought was a nuisance, but then find out they've now violated federal law in the process when they did it. But there are a lot of additional things that are in this that I think just require some more attention. There's a section in this where it talks about that if they pay a ransomware, that they also have to conduct a due diligence review alternative to making the ransomware payments, and they have to do an analysis. I assume that's something they're going to have to turn in to someone after the fact of show me you did your due diligence review of other alternatives. So there are lots of other issues that are laid out here that I have some big concerns on. Side by side on this, it is ironic to me that we're about to talk about the Fisma piece, and in the Fisma piece, agencies have 30 days to be able to contact an affected business that the agency finds out that they've been attacked. Agencies have 30 days to do that, but a local business has 24 hours after they pay the fine to be able to get it back to the agencies. CISA has 2 years to be able to pull its report together. Individual businesses have 72 hours. So there's just some inconsistency of how we're handling individual businesses and how we're actually walking through this. I also have some real questions on what we're doing on nonprofits, the affiliation side that I'll get into in a little bit, what this means for hospitals, tribes, tribal businesses. The folks that are in the ecosystem here of ransomware are not affected. There are negotiators, that there's actually a business on dealing with ransomware negotiators. They're left out of this. So I'm just saying there are a lot of holes in this, that this is definitely an issue we need to address. I just think that this cake is 30 minutes of baked into a 45-minute bake, if I can say that. And I'd love some more time to be able to finish it out so that when we get this passed, we have the things in it that we really need to have in it.
Before I recognize Senator Hassan, I just wanted the one comment about the due diligence with the ransomware. They're not required to provide that to the government. It's really, as we heard from the FBI in particular, that ransom should not be paid. And every effort should be made not to do that. Because when you give criminals ransom, guess what you get? You get more attempts to get ransom. And we have to push back and try to stop that practice. So it is best practices to find alternatives and to seek those out, and hopefully those alternatives would be available from FBI and CISA and others.
By the way,
Hassan?
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for having this markup today. I just want to say that I'm going to be opposing the Scott Amendment. Cybersecurity, cyber communication is unique. The threat of cyber attacks is unique. The threat of ransomware is unique. This is the largest threat that we have overall to our businesses, to our national security, to our state and local security. I come from a state where most businesses are well under 500 employees. And I come from a state that has been hit by ransomware attacks, very small organizations that then come to state and local and federal governments and say, help us. And that is our role. Because the other thing we all know is that because of the way cyber connectivity works, we are only as strong as the smallest, weakest cyber system that we have. And so I support the overall bill. I do understand, Senator Langford, some of the concerns you're raising. I do think that there are some issues we need to drill down on and make sure that we're getting this balance of reporting right. But what I am hearing from my businesses, from my small organizations, is that they want some uniformity. They want some requirements so that when one small business gets hit, another small business knows about it and knows what to do. We now have federal cyber coordinators in every state, or should have them soon because of legislation we all passed. They can be a critical support to not only state and local governments, but to the private sector to help them understand the way this system works. And I think they're going to be very important folks on the ground here. But I do not think we should be drawing analogies to other kinds of crimes and other kinds of reporting systems because of the unique nature of this threat and because of the ripple effect that one attack and one ransom payment, no matter how large your organization is or how small your organization is, can make on a whole sector, local, state, and federal government, and our national security.
Mr. Chairman?
Any other comments? Senator Portman.
Just a couple of thoughts. Again, I'm supporting the amendment. But Senator Langford raised some good points. I just want to make it clear, this legislation provides the 72 hours for a major incident with regard to the federal government. We make this line up with this legislation. So it's not 72 hours for a smaller incident. That's within hours. You've got to tell OMB. But for major incidents, we make these entirely consistent. So the issue you were talking about was talking to people whose information has been compromised. And that also lines up with what the general federal standard is. So there is a consistency here, just so you know. And I'm sorry that hasn't been explained properly. In terms of the legislative text, we put it out September 1st. And so it wasn't put out yesterday. It was put out September 1st. And should we or could we have done more? Yeah. as always, but we're also always all busy. And, we have had this come up in several hearings, and again, I'm supporting the amendment. So I think there's a need to make sure we have this right balance. But I would hate to see us not take this step today to deal with critical infrastructure. And I do think that the Fisma provisions are consistent with these provisions, and deliberately so.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Senator Romney.
And that is, were the cutoff, let's say, 200 employees, I'd be in favor of that provision, that businesses smaller than 200 don't have to report. But I'd like to have businesses over 200 reporting. That's not an option before us today. How do I proceed?
It will be an option, Senator. We potentially will have an amendment from Senator Langford. I haven't had a chance to talk to him this morning.
Okay.
Senator Portman can modify his amendment. Senator Portman has an amendment for 500. He can modify that later in our discussion.
Yes, I was talking about Senator Scott's amendment. Well, he can, but he may not want to modify his amendment.
Yeah, he may not.
I doubt I will.
He doubts he will.
So he may not modify, but you will have the choice to do that later. Right now it stands at 50. Senator Portman has an amendment that raises the exemption to 500. I think based on conversations I've had, it's somewhere in the middle is where we're trying to hopefully land, and we're going to get to that point. That's why I'm voting no on this amendment now, because we will get to a point where we have to have this information, as we've talked about. And just want to pick up on Senator Hassan, too, how the cyber threat is so different than some of the other criminal attacks we see. To make a comparison to stealing cars on an auto lot, if you think of cybersecurity as a national security threat, that's why we're hoping to get this legislation in the National Defense Authorization. Stealing cars in a car lot is not a national security threat. We have to deal with this in different ways and have to be very serious about that. So I would hope that we would vote no on this amendment, but certainly in the spirit of what Senator Scott is saying, that there's a cutoff, although he takes the cutoff to the extreme, that if there's a cutoff, that we will definitely address that issue, because that seems to be where we're all coming together to realize there needs to be a modification. So if you would hang tough with that would be great. I also want to pick up on Senator Portman's comments. Everybody's staff had this September 1st, and there have been meetings with Homeland Security staff from both the ranking member and the chair with your staffs over that time period. We've been always open to finding common ground, because we have to act, and we have to act quickly because of the nature and the severity of this threat. It is our intent to get it into NDAA, but that means we have time before it gets into NDAA. And as you know, that's a very collaborative process as well. We would like to move this bill, make what modifications people feel comfortable with right now in terms of the size of business. That's fine. But I would hope that we could move this forward out of committee today so that we can continue to have discussions over the next few weeks before NDAA comes before us in the Senate. But I hope we're all in agreement that this is not something we can wait on. The cyber criminals are not waiting. They're actively engaged today. So we'll now proceed to the consideration of Scott Amendment 1 to Senate 2875. Hearing no further debate, the question's on adoption. All those in favor will say aye. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Carper.
Senator Carper votes nay by proxy.
Senator Hassan. No. Senator Sinema. No. Senator Rosen. No. Senator Padilla. No. Senator Ossoff. No. We have agreement on Portman 1. Senator Portman. Aye. Senator Johnson. Aye. Senator Paul. Aye. Senator Langford. Aye. Senator Romney. Aye. Senator Scott. Aye. Senator Hawley. Aye. Senator Peters.
No.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote of those present, the yeas are 6, the nays are 6. On the vote by proxy, the yeas are 1, the nays are 1. On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 7, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Scott Amendment number 1 is not adopted. Is there any other amendment to come before us?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Portman.
I'd like to offer Portman Amendment number 1 as modified.
You may proceed.
The goal with this bill all along has been to provide CISA with visibility into these cyber attacks on our private sector. companies and also with regard to Fisma, with regard to the government. In order to do so, the bill provides companies protection against liability for the act of submitting those reports to CISA. And that liability protection is very important to the private sector. As noted earlier, that the private sector is represented by groups like the Chamber of Commerce support this legislation. One reason they support this legislation is that they believe that we are going to handle the liability issue in a balanced way. In other words, we're not trying to create new lawsuits, and we're not trying to stop lawsuits that would be appropriate. We're just trying to keep it as it is. And so in order to do that, and to keep that balance between plaintiff and defendant in civil litigation, I'm proposing a provision that would ensure that plaintiffs are not given an unfair advantage in litigation by being able to obtain these reports that we're requiring in the discovery process, or the documents or other materials that are actually used to create the report. I know this has been a controversial issue, and I want to thank Chairman Peters for working with us to try to get to something that, again, achieves what the business community expects and what I think we expect as a committee, which is to end up, again, not creating new advantages or disadvantages, but holding on to the status quo. I would also ask that this amendment be modified, as it has been in the writing you have, if you have it before you, to exempt religious organizations from the ransomware provisions. They're, of course, already exempted from the broader one, the critical infrastructure one. But Senator Scott raised this today. Others have raised it. And I do think that's appropriate to exempt them from the ransomware provisions. So that would be the modification to this Portman Amendment 1. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman, and I appreciate our work together on this to have neutrality, which I think we achieved in having support from all folks engaged in this. If there's no further debate on this amendment, the question is on the adoption. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We're going to take a brief recess to discuss Portman Amendment number 2. We're in recess. We're going to gavel back into session for the markup. We are back now discussing Amendment 2 from Senator Portman. I look forward to continuing a robust discussion on this amendment, but I will support this amendment now in the spirit of moving forward. I think as a committee we all fully recognize the importance of dealing with the cyber threat that we face in this country, and that it's a critical element of Homeland Security. We do know that there are issues that have been raised with the language in this legislation, but today's action is the first step in what will hopefully be another step, which will be part of the National Defense Authorization because of the national security implications of this. You have my commitment as chair. You have a commitment from the ranking member to work with members on both sides to address any issues so that we have a good bipartisan product that deals with a significant threat we're facing. I would hope my colleagues who support the Portman Amendment would also then support final or passage of this bill out of committee. Any other further comments? We will now proceed to consideration. All those in favor of the Portman Amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and Senator Scott is recognized as a nay vote. Will be recorded as a nay vote. The Portman Amendment is adopted. Are there any other amendments? Okay, where do we go?
Told me he wasn't going to do that.
If there's no further debate or amendments, the question is on final passage of S 2875 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, Senator Scott will be recorded as a nay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Portman.
I'd like to record by proxy Senator Johnson as a no and Senator Paul as a no.
They will be recorded as such. We will now proceed to consideration of S-2902, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2021. I ask unanimous consent that the committee consider the Peters-Portman substitute amendment as modified to S-2902 as the underlying bill. Are there any comments on this bill or amendments? Seeing none. The question is whether to favorably report 2902 is amended. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the Senate. Senator Portman.
I'd like to report that by proxy, Senator Johnson is an aye and Senator Paul is an aye.
They will be recorded as nays. That completes.
Ayes.
I'm sorry.
Ayes. I know you're used to that. But.
Yeah. I tell you, it's that cognitive bias, I guess. So they will be recorded as such. No further voting here today, but we'll take any comments that members would like to make before we gavel out.
Thank you, Chairman.
Seeing no other comments, this committee markup is now adjourned.